Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. No, 1 minute after 12. Good afternoon. We just about made it. Pretty good. Anyway, welcome to the Smithsonian National Postal Museum, and I'm the director, Alan Kane. September was an interesting month for us. September was an exciting month. We opened up the new Gross Gallery upstairs, and how many have seen it so far? Did you like it? Pretty incredible, isn't it? Seven years of work. It's amazing. 7 years for Cheryl and Daniel and others to put the content together. 4 years to do the conservation. Big job. 3 years to put all the material on the boards and the pull-out frames. And interestingly enough, if you take the boards and those pull-out frames and put them end to end, 3.5 times the size of the Washington Monument. A lot of stuff up there. A lot of stuff. So anyway, we opened up Gross, and we had 4 big events celebrating the opening, and all of a sudden the government shut down. What a downer after we got going. What a downer. But the government's back open. Now, I'm not sure that's good or bad, but it's open. And we're now in October. And October now starts with us with the Sundman lecture series. And it's the 11th one. I can't believe 11 already. Isn't that unbelievable? And I'd like to thank Daniel Piazza, for coordinating all of this and setting this all up for us. And we have a real treat today in Chris West being here, all the way from across the pond, making his rounds in the States. So we have a real treat for you. But I have to thank Don and David. David, raise your hand. And Don's over here. They're phenomenal. They give amazing support to the museum. And the lecture that they set up was in honor of their father. And he'd be proud of their sons right now, quite frankly, in what they've accomplished. So it's my pleasure at this point to introduce Don Sundman.
Alan Kane is my favorite museum director. He's just amazing that he came into the Postal Museum and just made it this vibrant, exciting place for our hobby, and then spearheaded this Gross Gallery opening, which is unbelievable for collectors, I think. And actually, my brother and I were approached by a previous director about starting this lecture series, and it didn't happen until Alan came, because he knows how to get things done. So he's added so much to our hobby. So welcome. I'm happy that you'd be here today. I want to tell you a little bit about my father, Maynard Sundman. He loved stamps and collecting and also business, and he really lived the American dream, and millions of collectors over many decades have benefited from his 2 businesses. My father also loved books, and he was a good customer at his local bookstore, and really was involved in lifelong learning, always trying to improve himself. And he would, I know, be very excited about this book and would enjoy this lecture very much. He was a nice man, he had a nice warm smile, and he liked people. So as a child, he sold stamps to his classmates, and after high school became a stamp dealer, but that business failed. He closed it when he entered the Army for World War II. During the war, he saved his money and supplemented it with winnings from gambling. He played craps over in Europe, and he'd send that money home to my mother, who would save it for when the war ended. And he really wanted to start another stamp company, which he did. So he analyzed his mistakes in business and developed a new business model. He and my mother moved to Littleton, New Hampshire from Connecticut and started the Littleton Stamp Company, 1945. So his dream was to bring the fun of collecting to a wide audience, and it worked. His company is now called Littleton Coin Company, and it's introduced millions of people to the world of collecting over the past 68 years. My brother David's expanded my father's business, and now they have like 350 employees, and it's called Littleton Coin Company. In 1974, my father bought Mystic Stamp Company and changed that business model to match Littleton's. And so I run Mystic. I moved there in 1974. And we've served customers for 90 years, and again, millions and millions of collectors. So it's really exciting. The hobby's been great to us, and we're so thrilled to be able to be part of the Post Museum and be involved in this lecture. I also want to thank Pam Gibson, who's the Sales Director of Politics and Prose. Pam? Right here. Okay. That's the bookstore, Politics and Prose bookstore, for her help in arranging the speaker. Casey Maloney, publisher of Picador Press. Also my brother David, president of Littleton Coin Company, and his beautiful daughter Elise for sponsoring the lecture. And I want to introduce Daniel Piazza, curator of philately here at the Postal Museum. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and thank you all for coming out this morning. Welcome to the National Postal Museum. All of us, as we came into this gallery this morning, passed the wall that proclaims every stamp tells a story. It's sort of the unofficial motto of the philately division here at the Postal Museum. It's certainly the spirit behind all of our exhibits and publications. And it was certainly something that Maynard Sundman believed, as Dave and Don tell us on the back of the program, that he was fascinated by stamps and the doors they opened to history and culture. We often speak of postage stamps as, in that metaphor, as being doors or windows into history and the past. But what does that really mean? How does that work mechanically? And that's really what we're going to see this morning. This book, A History of Britain in 36 Postage Stamps, really is a series of 36 meditations, if you will, each one of them inspired by a particular postage stamp and showing us how it is a lens or a window or a door into its particular period in time, the ethos of the period that produced it. And so when this book was going to be published, and we learned that Chris was going to be in the United States on a book tour, and that really just seemed to mesh so nicely with our own concept of every stamp tells a story that we couldn't resist the invitation, and we're so pleased that he took us up on it. And so now I'd like you to I'd like you to welcome Chris West, who's going to speak to us on A History of Britain in 36 Postage Stamps. The book was published on Tuesday, and after the talk, it will be available in the gift shop, and Chris will be willing to sign copies as well. Chris West.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you to Don for sponsoring and his brother. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful. And thank you for turning up. I hope you're going to have a good time. I hope you, as I suppose, a slightly corny thing to say, but I hope you enjoy the lecture as much as I enjoyed writing this book, which has been a labour of love for many, many years. I collected stamps. Normally when I give a reading in a bookshop, I say, who collected stamps? I don't think I'm going to bother here. I think I know the answer to that. However, again, when I'm in a bookshop, very often, my next question is, who then stopped collecting stamps? And again, I'm not even going to bother here asking that question. But in the bookshops, very often, a lot of hands go up, and I would be one of them. I have to hold my hand up. 16 years old, I had a not very good stamp collection, and I did rather sort of abandon the hobby at that time because other things leapt into consciousness. However, many years later, I rediscovered this beautiful album in an attic. I can come and have a look at it afterwards. There is a lovely story behind this. I mean, I had a really rubbish collection as a boy. I mean, it's really bad. But one day, I went to have tea with my dear Uncle Frank, a lovely old boy. He'd fought in the First World War in the trenches. We used to go and have tea with him sometimes and sit and chat. And as you do when you're sort of 10 or something, I just piped up, I'm collecting stamps. And he said, oh, that's very interesting. I used to do that when I was a boy. I got my album somewhere. And he wandered off. He came back with this lovely album. And I looked through it. It was full of Victorian and Edwardian stamps. And there's nothing from beyond about 1906 in here. The album actually is dedicated February 6, 1901, when it was given, and I think he probably filled it in for a few years, then again drifted away from the hobby. And I gave it back to him and said, oh, that's fantastic. And he said, oh, well, I don't really look at it any longer. Why don't you have it? So I was blown away and said, well, thank you, that's marvellous. And I still do have it, and it's a real treasure. It's a lovely, lovely album. It's slightly less lovely because I took it to school when I was still collecting, and some word I shall not say in front of a mixed audience nicked half the stamps from it. That was not good news. However, as often in life, many years later, that turned out to be quite a good thing, because when my father died in 2005, and I had to go and clear the attic out at home. So I was going through all this stuff upstairs, and I found a little canvas bag, opened it, inside was the stamp album. And I started looking through it. Oh, this is lovely. Then I got to the Great Britain bit. There was these empty spaces there. I thought, oh, God, yes, I remember somebody pinched them. And then I thought, well, hang about. The best revenge is to have a happy life. I shall build the collection up again. And so that's what I did. And I started collecting just the Victorian and the Edwardian ones to start with. And then sort of got hooked and collected more and more and more. And I'm still doing it. Excuse me. As I started collecting, I became fascinated in the kinds of thing Dan was talking about, this links between the stamps and history. That to me, as I was getting these stamps, they just intrigued me about what was Britain like at the time this stamp came out, what was happening historically. One of the interesting things about stamps is they have a kind of double life. They are very public. There's usually, especially more recently, but even in the old Victorian days, there's a kind of political imperative behind them. Stamps represent the way a nation would like to see itself, or let's say the way in which perhaps an elite within the nation would like to see itself. They are public, they're political statements. They're also artistic statements because they naturally reflect the design theories, the popular design ideas of the time. And yet, of course, they're also wonderfully private because most stamps were on a letter and there was a declaration of love inside that letter, or a declaration from the front of the First World War about what's been happening, or deeply, deeply personal stories inside the letter, inside the envelope on which the stamp was. Of course, there might have been a gas bill or something, I don't know. I can't guarantee it's going to be a wonderful personal story, but I can always imagine. So I started building this. As I filled the album, I got a new album. I left this one as it was in the end, because I thought, just leave it, get a modern one, put the stamps in there. And actually, there's more space taken up with stuff about history in the album than there are with stamps, because I just became so intrigued about the stories that each stamp tells. And then it turned into this book. Here we are, History of Britain in 36 Postage Stamps. Choosing 36 was rather hard going, because there's been an awful lot of them. But I managed in the end. Obviously, I had to start with this one. Needs no introduction. The wonderful penny black. And I think still one of the most beautiful stamps ever produced. It's amazing how the designers got it absolutely right first time round. You know the story of Rowland Hill. I'm sure I don't need to tell you this story, but just to comment on what an amazing man he was. And we've heard from Don about the entrepreneurial traits that your dad had, which just sounds a lovely man, and a great businessman. And Rowland Hill had these characteristics. He was like an entrepreneur. He didn't take no for an answer, and he had a vision, and he worked towards it. And he had a lot of people standing in his way. There was an old boy who worked at the British Post Office called Colonel W.L. Maberley. And his comment when Rowland Hill suggested penny post was, "This is an utterly preposterous idea." And he spent the rest of his life annoying Rowland Hill, trying to sort of frustrate his plans for postal reform. But of course failed, I'm glad to say. 1840, the stamp actually came out. The system beforehand was a complete shambles, as you know. You went to the post office and said, "I want to send a letter to Aberystwyth," and they looked at a great list and said, "Oh, that'll be 7 pence. Oh, it weighs more than an ounce, it'll be 11 pence. Sent it off, and then the recipient paid for it. You didn't pay for it, like you do nowadays. The recipient paid, which of course is hopelessly inefficient, because if there was nobody in, it never got delivered. Sometimes people would have it as a simple code, just to write somebody a letter to say they're alive, I'm okay. You send the letter, just go through the post, the postman turns up, here's the letter. Oh, no, I don't want it, because it doesn't matter, because you've got the message, I'm still alive. And Hill actually started, he got into postal reform because one day the postman turned up at his family home with some letters, and they were so expensive, the money they wanted, he was sent into Birmingham to sell some clothes to pay for the receipt of the letters. So it was badly in need of reform, and along came Rowland Hill, great man, made this happen. So that's the story of the penny black. It starts off with an entrepreneur, a social entrepreneur. He didn't do it. He wasn't founding a business, but he was creating a vibrant social institution, which is what I think what entrepreneurs do. It's just a subset of it. They do a business side. He did something in government. Interestingly, for the modern debate about the value of the post office is still carrying on, where in Britain the Royal Mail's been privatised. There's a question about what's going to happen to the USPS. Rowland Hill understood very clearly that there are hidden non-monetary values to having a good postal system, that they bind the community together, they help people, they increase literacy. They did in the Victorian days anyway, because people were encouraged to learn to read and write so they could communicate. It made life more pleasant in lots of ways that weren't reflected in the monetary values of the stamps. And this is still a live issue today, I think. Excuse me, I have a slightly sore throat. I keep on swigging away at this water. My apologies for the interruption of delivery. Anyway, let's move on to the next stamp. I've kind of cheated here because I've got one of these embossed stamps in my collection, but it's not the greatest example in the world, so I just nicked this Philympia 1970, which is actually quite an interesting stamp. It's the last pre-decimal stamp to come out. So it's not without interest, but it's here at this point in the talk because it's from 1847, which of course is a very significant year in your philately over here in America. The first stamps came out. And it's also a link with America and Britain, because this is the shilling embossed was the stamp you'd put on your letter to send to the States. That was the rate. It was a shilling, and the stamp was especially made in order to put on letters to going to the USA. And for me, this stamp always makes me think about entrepreneurship again, with Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the great engineer, with his steamships. And he had this vision of an iron road from London to New York. You'd get the train at Paddington Station, take his wonderful Great Western Railway to Avonmouth, you'd get on an ocean liner, which he'd built, and you'd go to New York. What a vision. Amazing man. Quite fantastic. And this is the stamp of that vision. It's also connected with Henry Bessemer, the man who invented the steel converter, which really was something which you then took on in America and really got the best out of. Andrew Carnegie did much more with it than we did in Britain. I'm afraid we were too busy empire building by that time. But Bessemer developed the system of embossing, which was used to make this stamp. So he's connected with that as well. So this shilling embossed has a wonderful resonance connecting in with the entrepreneurial history of the Victorian era. And boy, was it entrepreneurial. I mean, it was a time of great economic advance. Okay, let's move on. Here's the oh, I got that. Next. Lovely. The penny lilac. Thank you. The penny lilac. This is, I think this is a very pleasant stamp. One of its joys is its ordinariness, because it's a symbol of how successful Rowland Hill's idea was. The Colonel said this would be a failure. All that will happen is the post office will lose money because the letter rates are lower. Of course, it was a massive success because more and more and more people wrote. And it changed the way people think. People became more reflective. They got into the habit of putting their thoughts down on paper, much more. Ordinary people did. And this stamp is a symbol of that success. 33 billion of these stamps were produced. It's an extraordinary number. I don't know, if you pile them on top of each other, I don't know how many Washington monuments you get, loads of them, I think. I mean, 33 billion is an enormous number. And this is a wonderful symbol of the success of the post office, and what a fabulous idea it was. The post office did other things. It introduced a telegram. It introduced the post office savings bank. It was a marvellous, progressive institution that really cared about the quality of life of ordinary people and did its best to bring about communication. A wonderful, wonderful image this is of success. Next stamp, please. Thank you. Now, here we are. This is the Jubilee issue. This isn't actually the Queen's Jubilee at all. The stamp just happened to come out the same year. We didn't do commemorative stamps in Britain until 1924. They were considered to be un-English. It's all right for Americans. You can do that with your Columbus issue and your Trans-Mississippi and things, but no. In Britain, we don't do that sort of thing. We have definitive stamps with the monarch on, nothing else. However, this actually came out in the Jubilee year, and so it became known as the Jubilees. And I must say, if I had my sort of one stamp issue I had to take with me to a desert island, it would be this one. It's such fun. It's colourful, it's bright, all the stamps are different. That's absolutely marvellous. And it's so relevant to Victorian society, late Victorian society. They replaced an issue which was called the Lilac and Green issue, which came out in 1883, which was trumpeted as being a wonderful unified issue. It's going to be very simple, with nice clear lines and elegant and all that sort of stuff. And out they came, and everybody hated them. They were boring. The postal staff couldn't tell which stamp was which. If you tried to soak them off an envelope, the ink ran. Everybody hated them, and so they got rid of them, and they went back to these ones, which all the critics and the experts and things said, oh, it's terribly cluttered, we don't like it. But the Victorians loved clutter. Go to a Victorian house, go to Osborne House or something, it's full of clutter, they love it. If this was Victorian, there'd be a pot plant here, there'd be a dead stag up there, there'd be an elephant's foot there with umbrellas, there'd be a great big sort of velour thing over this, and there'd be a plate on the wall. There was stuff everywhere. The Victorians loved stuff, and they crammed their houses full of stuff. And here they are, they've crammed their stamp full of stuff as well. And they've got these wonderful curtains, which I think is also very Victorian, because the Victorians, although they were in many ways terribly, terribly stiff upper lip, they secretly loved a bit of melodrama. And they'd all go to the theatre, and they'd see things like East Lynne, where the heroine said, dead, but never called me mother, and this sort of thing. They loved this sort of stuff. And there was a wonderful man, Francis Leveson, twirling his moustaches, trying to seduce the ladies. They loved this thing, the Victorians. And here are the curtains, which would peel back to reveal this wonderful soap opera, which they all enjoyed hugely. There was more to the Victorians than meets the eye, I think. It's all part of the fun of the Victorians. And it is in the stamps, sir, but in a quiet sort of way. You have to kind of dig in there and find it, and it's all there. Wonderful. Love the Victorians. However, it came to the end. Dear old lady passed away in 1901. I haven't got an Edward VII stamp. I talk about it in the book, but I think probably we need to whiz on to our next stamp, please, madam. The seahorse. What a beautiful stamp. I think, again, artistically, this is absolutely gorgeous. Politically, it's a shameless piece of propaganda for Britannia ruling the waves, which of course we did do. I mean, there's no doubt about it. The British Navy in 1913, when this stamp came out, was not only the biggest in the world, it was bigger than the next two navies put together. That was Germany and the USA. So this beautiful, marvellous stamp is shameless political propaganda, really. Interestingly enough, the naval superiority that Britain had with all these battleships we built was virtually useless. And we nearly lost the First World War because of the submarines, because they became the most important naval vessel in the First World War. Not these battleships at all. Certainly not horses pulling. Never worked. They experimented, the horses kept sinking. Don't know why. But there is something, I mean, there's something, right, you can imagine a little periscope emerging in the corner there and firing a torpedo and sinking this thing. In Britain, we say that's not cricket, but it's war. And we nearly lost. In 1917, Britain nearly starved, which would have made all the sacrifice worthless, because nobody had any food back home because of the submarine. So I'm afraid the glory of the British battleship was not a huge amount of use. We did sort of half won the Battle of Jutland, which was a battleship encounter, but that wasn't crucial. It was the war at sea with the U-boats that was the thing in the First World War. But of course also it was fought on land. Madam, please. And this stamp has a very tragic side to it. It's a King George V definitive. It's an ordinary stamp, penny stamp, letter rate. If you're an officer, or no, if your son or your husband was an officer, they got killed in the war, you'd get a telegram. If your son or husband was an ordinary soldier, you just got a letter. with one of these stamps on. So one of these comes popping through your letterbox with War Office written on it, not overprinted. They'd stopped doing overprints by then. And inside you get one of these. Can you just click it on, please, for a second? You've got this. And I've got copies of this here. This was a form, Army Form B104-82. And then line, Madam, it is my painful duty to inform you that a report has been received from the War Office notifying the death of number, rank, and then finally, rather less important, name, regiment which occurred on the report is to the effect that he was, and they even killed in action, happened so often they just had a stamp for it. What a terrible thing when you think about it. That's how people got the news of a loved one's death. And maybe it had to be that way. I mean, after the first battle of the Somme, 1st of July 1916, 20,000 people killed in one day. You know, they couldn't write letters to everybody. I suppose they had to use these things. But there's something sort of terrifyingly evocative about this. And if you'd like to just take the thing back, please, back to this stamp, because that was a stamp that would be on the envelope that would have brought that terrible news. I've got these. Everyone wants to have a look at it afterwards. Please do so. Okay, let's march on. A couple of ones. Lovely, thank you very much. Now we're getting into the 1920s, and this fine stamp, Harold Nelson's British Empire exhibition from 1924. Before I started collecting, I didn't even know this exhibition had ever happened. It was something I knew nothing about at all, but it was an amazing event. It had 25 million visitors, which doesn't mean 25 million people went to it, but there were 25 million visits, should I say, because lots of people went a number of times. It was held in Wembley on what was then sort of empty ground. It was a rather bizarre story behind this ground that some people had decided, and I think it's a very reasonable thing to want to do, is to try and beat the French, and to build an Eiffel Tower in London that was bigger, of course. And they got about 100 feet and then ran out of money. And the ground, it just sat there for about 30 years. And the Empire exhibition was actually built on the ground where this sort of failed Eiffel Tower was. The stamp says an awful lot about the era, some of it very ironic. There was a competition launched to have a stamp for this. The king finally, he was a great philatelist. George V was a great philatelist and built on the royal collection, which is already quite big because Prince Albert had been, not Prince Albert, Prince Alfred, one of Queen Victoria's sons, had been a great collector. But George really built the collection up to massive proportions and was very keen on the nation stamps, and it was he who really frowned on these commemorative stamps. But he was a very shrewd man, not a hugely likeable man, but he was very sharp, and he understood the value of stamps as propaganda. Very much like Roosevelt here in the States, who both loved stamps and understood that they do speak to people. And I think when the Empire exhibition stamp was mooted, he saw the point. And although it was a little bit un-British to have commemorative stamps, just in this case he'd make an exception. So we had a competition was launched, and it was run by Eric Gill, who was a great designer, somewhat flawed human being, but a great designer, very modernist. The king looked at this and said, "Well, I'm not having this. Get somebody else." And they got Harold Nelson to do it. And this is good old-fashioned Empire, tub-thumping, chest-beating, lion-roaring stuff. And it's very beautiful. It's a lovely stamp. Fabulous stamp. But it, again, a bit like the seahorse. It's sort of shameless propaganda. But, of course, there's the sun in the background by the postage, by the lion. Now, what's that sun doing? Is it rising on a glorious empire? It's setting on an empire whose days were numbered. It was numbered after the First World War. Britain's debt to GDP ratio sort of went through the roof. We couldn't afford to run the empire any longer after the First World War. And then we had the massacre of Amritsar in 1919, when General Dyer went and shot about 1,000 people for standing around, sort of, I don't know, not doing as they were told. A terrible, terrible, terrible piece of imperial arrogance. But so fascinating. This is why history is so strange and how things change over time. Dyer, who massacred these people, his last words were, "Did I do the right thing?" Isn't that extraordinary? Anyway, so that didn't help the empire either. So you got people like Gandhi saying, "Go, quit India." And so this stamp was a wonderful ironic story, because while it was coming out and the lion was roaring away, what was really happening was the empire was beginning to crumble. It was beginning to fall apart. I think people still had fun at the exhibition. The style is it's quite old school, isn't it? These sort of letters and things. It's an engraved stamp, it's an old-fashioned piece of technology making it. It looks old. If we move on to the next one, please. Suddenly, we're in a new era. We're in the 1930s now, mid-30s, modernism. It's a photogravure technology, so it's a different way of producing stamps. All the imperial flag waving and things gone. Okay, there's a crown and things, but I mean, it's not the same. It's a new vision is behind this, and this was behind a lot of the public art in Britain in the 1930s. A bit like the New Deal art you had here. It's the same idea that it is a job of public bodies to make life beautiful and attractive and pleasant, and to produce beautiful objects. And there were a lot of the post boxes and phone boxes designed by George Gilbert Scott. The tube stations, the tube map, all sorts of things were suddenly done beautifully by the powers that be, which is a new idea, really. And this stamp is a lovely example of it, I think. It's a very beautiful stamp and a very powerful image, because there's a very, very sinister stamp coming up next, which is not a real one, but this is a parody of it done by the Nazis. And there's another one, actually, the Nazis did of of the coronation stamp. There we are, Stalin and King. So, but I mean, these parodies, horrible as they are, do show the power of the postage stamp. You know, this isn't just a silly little bit of paper you stick on a letter and forget about. This is a very important statement. It is a historical object.
A question. Tehran, 1943. Was this made after the conference?
I assume it must have been. Yes, I assume it was a sort of a comment on the conference. Yeah. Which, of course, itself was a sad event. These conferences during the war were very sad events for Britain, because it was a time when you got the impression that Roosevelt and Stalin were sort of basically dividing the world up between themselves, and poor old Britain was being left out because we weren't big enough any longer. That's the way it was. Anyway, the war came along, and when these conferences were happening, if you could move us on, please, home. Thank you very much. We had him first of all. Sorry, we're going back in time suddenly. It's Edward VIII. There's a great story about this stamp. It's probably slightly irrelevant to history, but this was designed by a 17-year-old. It was designed by a young boy called Hubert Brown. And as he does when you're 17, you just think, oh, I'll do this, I'll design it, I'll send it off to the post office. They sent it off to Harrison's, the stamp printers, actually, and then forgot about it. He was a 17-year-old, he had other things to think about. And then the stamp appeared, and he said to his dad, oh, it's my stamp. And his dad said, was it? Yeah, and he said, yeah, look, I sent the design off. So his dad contacted the post office and said, can you give us some credit for this, please? And the post office said, no, we designed it. It says quite a lot about the arrogance of power that was still around in those days. And bless him, his dad fought a really long battle to get Hubert Brown credited as a designer, which has been won. And he is now, if you get the Stanley Gibbons catalogue, it says Designer H. Brown. I think it says something like adapted by Harrison and Co. So he hasn't completely got the credit, but people who know that he designed it, 17 years old. And this was going to be a new era with a new monarch and a beautiful modern stamp. What a lovely, clear, modern design. Fabulous piece of design. Absolute disastrous king. Not the right man for the job. Had a big ego. Monarchs are much better at being rather quiet, just listening, putting the other point of view. George V was good at that as well. He was an odd man, an objectionable man in lots of ways, but he listened and thought about things. And Stanley Baldwin once said, we ought to go out and shoot these people going on strike, and the king said, try living on their wages for a week, Mr. Baldwin. But that was his dad. He was a difficult man. So he abdicated. Interesting, it's still people are very divided about Edward VIII. Was he this rather dodgy, sort of egotistical, narcissistic man who flirted with fascism, or was he somebody who gave it all up for love, rejected the frippery of public office for love? Which one? And people still debate about that. Maybe he was both. It's interesting. On we move to the war. It started, and the lovely stamps, I think, the George VI definitives. Bright colours, lovely bright colours. A lot of the low values were However, the war soon started eating away at Britain's resources, and we ended up, if you come back one please, with that. They took all the colour out because they were short of ink. And we were short of everything else as well, including money. And I think by about mid-1941, basically, Britain was bankrupt. Fortunately, you guys came and helped us out with Lend-Lease, which is very fortunate, otherwise I don't know what would have happened. We'd probably lost the war, basically, that's what would have happened. So thank you very much. And let's move on to the Victory stamp from 1946. And this is a very interesting stamp. This tells a lot of history bundled up in this one, because this is a stamp celebrating victory. We've beaten the whatevers, you know. We've won. Well, it's not very exciting, is it? It's not very triumphal. Because it isn't even a victory stamp. It's a first anniversary of victory stamp. It came out in 1946. And it's all about reconstruction. It's rather sort of earnest and worthy. And that's partially because in 1945 we had the big general election when Winston Churchill was booted out of office. He'd saved the nation, and everybody liked him, but they didn't think much of his party, the Conservatives. They wanted political change. They wanted the Labour Party, the Socialist Party, Clement Attlee. A man, Churchill once said, "An empty cab drew outside number 10 Downing Street, and Clement Attlee got out." But it's politics. So it was a very different mindset, more egalitarian, quite worthy, striving, but this need to reconstruct the country, and whatever one's politics, what comes out of this stamp is reconstruction. We've got to get the agriculture sorted out, got to build more houses for people, get our industry back, which had been damaged by the war, get our trade going again. We had virtually no cargo ships, they'd all been sunk. So we had to resurrect. We also had the National Health Service, which is, of course, something of a hot issue here in the States these days. You've got Obamacare, we had Attlee Care. And Attlee Care, in truth, I think has been very successful. But it's not been what they thought it was going to be, because when Attlee Care was introduced, the people were told, well, it's going to be a bit expensive to start with, but as people get healthier, the costs are going to come down. This has not happened. They have gone up and up and up and up and up. But, you know, it's still it's a model copied in most of Western Europe, so it's not a uniquely eccentric idea, but it's kind of in this time. I'd have taken the liner off and put a stethoscope on, but they kind of didn't get around to that. But that's the Victory stamp, anyhow. It's very it's of its era, as they all are. Let's move on anyway. Something brighter. This is, I think, my desert island postage stamp. If I had to take one stamp with me to a desert island, it would be this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful Edmund Dulac coronation from 1953. Dulac, one of our best stamp designers, never lived to see the stamp produced. He died before it actually appeared in post offices. It was terribly sad. Very interesting. The Queen is looking at us straight in the eye. That didn't happen before. If you go, so can you just click it back for a second, back to old King George? There is absolutely profile side on. They experimented in 1913 when King George V came to the throne. The King turned a little bit, about three-quarter profile, to the audience on the stamp, and nobody liked it. And there were so many complaints that they got rid of it, and he went back to being sort of side on. And then this said, "Oh no, can we go back to? Thank you, back to there you are, Her Majesty looking at us straight in the eye." And so that's a very radical gesture. That's very radical. That's a big change. So it says, you know, there are going to be new things happening in this reign. And what a beautiful stamp. And she looks lovely on it, and it's just fantastic. It's an absolute masterpiece, I think. But it is a stamp of changes afoot. Can you move on, please? This is a funny one. The nice definitive stamps came out at the same time. This one is Michael Farabell's fourpence with the Dorothy Wilding portrait of the Queen. And most people, and it's got this writing, if you just ignore the writing for a minute, the Parliamentary conference and things, there's a good story behind that. We'll take that for a moment. The stamp, it looks a little bit, it's fussier than the King George. If you compare that with the Edward VIII one, for example, it's become much fussier and frillier and things like that. And again, critics tend to say, oh, we don't like this, it's fussy, and stamps ought to be simple. But actually, people liked it. People wanted a bit of fuss and frills. After the austerity of the war and the cruelty of the war, so many people came back from the war with horrible memories of things they'd seen and done. They wanted the cottage with roses round the door and things. This is a kind of philatelic equivalent to that. This actual stamp itself is a wonderfully botched up job. To me, this stamp is the Suez fiasco in a stamp. It's a complete mess. And it happened, I mean, and like Suez, it happened because of official incompetence. Quite extraordinary. There was a thing called the Parliamentary Conference. It's a kind of roving conference that takes place every year, supposedly in democracies. So it has taken place in Pyongyang before now, so I think they always choose very good places. But it was in London in 1957, and there it happened, and the man in charge of it was a chap called Malcolm Scott, and he knew that the Postmaster General said, look, yeah, we need a stamp for this, and the Postmaster General said, no, we don't. Nobody's heard of this thing. Oh, yes, we do. No, we don't. Yes, we do. No, we don't. Yes, we do. No, we don't. Finally, very shortly before the conference was due to start, it was agreed, OK, we'll do a stamp. But it was too late to get a designer in, and the head of design at the post office had to go home one evening with his letter set and put Parliamentary Conference down the side. That's how much of a hurry it was done in. I sent off to the printers, and the printers phoned him up and said, you've left out the 46. And he said, oh, ... well, put it in somewhere. And so they did. And that's stamp design, the Suez version of stamp design. It is actually very interesting. If talking about Suez, that Eisenhower and Eden, they communicated by post through most of the build-up to the Suez crisis. It was all done by post. They didn't even phone each other until the whole thing had started. Quite extraordinary. It's amazing how things were done in those days. Forget emails and things, that they actually wrote each other letters. And Eden still didn't understand. Eisenhower was very clear. We are not going to support you if you do this. He just sort of didn't take any notice. It all goes to show how the written word can be ignored if that's what you want to do. Next one, please. Anyway, we're getting on into the 1960s now. And in 1964, another big political change, Labour government again, Harold Wilson, Prime Minister, with his pipe and his raincoat. And he once stuffed his pipe in his pocket and left it there, and his raincoat caught fire. All this stuff. A fundamentally decent man, I think. And his Postmaster General was a guy called the Viscount Stansgate, although actually his name was Anthony Wedgwood Benn. He doesn't like that either. Tony Benn, we've got to call him, because that's sort of, working class sort of thing. He's as posh as anybody, in fact. Anyway, Tony Benn wanted to get the Queen's head off the stamps. This was, the new Labour Britain, get rid of the Queen's head. And he got in touch with David Gentleman, who's a very fine British stamp designer. And David Gentleman produced a little portfolio of stamps with no Queen's heads on and took them to the Queen. And Ben took them to the Queen. And he thought, I'll do a set with racehorses on, because the Queen's nuts about horse racing. Went to Buckingham Palace and he had to put them on the floor. It's quite a comical scene. And the Queen stood there with a certain amount of froideur on her face, I imagine, as he sort of put out all these stamps without her face on. And Ben said, what do you think of that? And Her Majesty said, interesting. And then communicated her displeasure to Harold Wilson the next day. However, they did take off sorry, can you just run them back just one stamp? You see the Dorothy Wilding portrait of the Queen? That was also on all the commemorative stamps. And so aesthetically, it was a bit of a sort of, it kind of overwhelmed the stamp a bit. From an artistic point of view, I can see the reason why they changed it. And there was a compromise whereby the Queen's head was replaced by a cameo, which I think is rather nice. Only artistically that worked well. This is the first set of stamps to come out with the cameo on. Lovely landscape set. And then shortly after that, the next one, please. The cameo got even smaller. And we won the World Cup. Yes! Hey, yeah, wonderful. We haven't won it since. Never mind. What a great time that was. 1966. I was a little bit young for the fun, but I mean, if there was a summer of love in Britain, it was then. It wasn't 1967. It was 1966. We had very good weather. The Beatles produced Revolver. The Kinks produced Sunny Afternoon. I mean, what an era. Fantastic. And everybody was into it. This is not... One of the criticisms, people say, oh, well, Swinging London, it was just a bunch of metropolitan trendies. But it wasn't, because people had radios, they had gramophones. I had a little gramophone I used to listen to these records on. People could join in, youngsters could join in. It may have been, when you read endless, rather boring biographies of people who were sort of swinging London types. You kind of get slightly nauseated by their own kind of self-importance, but this was happening for everybody. It wasn't just swinging London, it was everywhere. There was a new vibrancy in the air, a nice colourful stamp, and we won the World Cup. How good's that? I think I was hiding behind the sofa for the last few minutes of the game. It was so exciting. If you'd like to move on, please, because here in the museum here, who apparently might be out on loan, is John Lennon's stamp collection. Because, I mean, what was the 60s without the Beatles? And John Lennon, like every young lad in the 50s, collected stamps. He had a little stamp collection. So did Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney didn't deface his stamp collection. John Lennon did, which sort of says a lot about the difference between the two of them. And he's provided Queen Victoria with a splendid beard and I think a cigar or something. And King George VI has got a beard and a kind of spy outfit as well. And I'd love to see the original of that. That's great. So that was the Beatles. I mean, what a fantastic band. Never equalled, in my view. I'm showing my age here. On we went. Decimal currency. 1971, we got rid of the old pounds, shillings and pence and had these beautiful Arnold Machin stamps, aren't they? They're right back to the simplicity, because it was time to move on. I like the 50s stamps, I like the Wildings, and they're very nice, but things have moved on, and designers like David Gentleman and Arnold Machin, who did the picture of the Queen on there, wanted to simplify things, clear, sharp images for the new age, and absolutely right. 15th of February, you could get yourself a first day cover, except you couldn't, because the post office was on strike. Welcome to the 1970s in Britain. Strikes, this, that and the other, God knows. We had British cars, used to be the best cars in Europe. In the 70s, they were not the best cars in Europe. They were rust buckets. I know, I drove around in one. British Leyland, it was a kind of agglomeration of British car companies, and it was an absolute disaster. It lost money, it produced rubbish cars, they were on strike all the time, and it ended up going bankrupt. The post office lost money. The post office never lost money. It lost, I think in 1975, £300 million or something. Everything was going completely bonkers. And I think the stock market collapsed. It was much worse than the British stock market during the Depression age. Forget that. It fell about 80%, something like that, almost as bad as Wall Street in the 1930s. There was a sudden sense, oh my God, we've lost the plot. What is happening? Where are we going? Who's in charge of this country around here? Oh dear. Things did not look good. In 1976, we had to go to the International Monetary Fund to borrow money. And now the real sort of payday lenders for completely screwed up countries. And we had to go cap in hand to them. Come here, some money, please. We can't run our country properly. Bad. Very bad. Very bad. So, Queen's Jubilee, 1977. Oh, who cares? The country hasn't got any money anyhow. We're not going to bother. We got some nice stamps. Richard Guyot did a nice stamp, intelligently echoing the Jubilee stamp we've seen earlier. Jubilee came along. Nobody really bothered very much. And the Queen, Prince Philip, went around, shook a few hands, and then they had these street parties. And people thought, well, okay, we'll go to the street party, why not? And they had rather a good time. And people started enjoying themselves, and they got the Union Jacks out, and they hung them on the street, and the Queen was on the television. Suddenly, I remember this, it was extraordinary. The nation suddenly thought, yeah, okay, we're all right. We haven't got an empire any longer. So what? When we're not as big as America. Well, tough. We're okay. We can do things. We're all right. We're good people. We've got something. We've got a history. We've got energy. We're not going to give up. And it was amazing. The Jubilee was an extraordinary event. Extraordinary event. It kind of saved the nation in a way. It really was very, very strange. I remember it. Very strange. So, kind of the birth of modern Britain. Just got a couple of stamps on modern Britain. Here's this nice Brian Sanders stamp. A good friend of mine lives in a village next to where I live. Here's the first black British person to feature on a stamp. No, to headline on a stamp, because he'd actually done one before with a little guy in the background. But here, this young lad is right at the foreground. Boy Scout celebration, youth organisations, 1981. Britain's becoming diverse. This guy's dad probably came over on a boat called the Windrush in 1948, or maybe his granddad even. And so we've got, and it hasn't, there have been, I don't want to kind of present a kind of over-glorified picture. There have been problems. The original arrivals on the Windrush met considerable prejudice, of which I feel very embarrassed, but unfortunately that happened. But things are moving on, and there we are. There's a nice symbol of it. The next stamp, please, madam. Europe. Britain is supposed to be part of Europe, but we can't make up our mind whether we want to be or not. The Post Office insists that Europe's a wonderful thing. We churned out endless stamps about any European event. The second election for the European Parliament got this stamp. We don't have a stamp for our own election. It's Europe one, and you get turnouts of about sort of 3% or something. No, I'm being facetious, but it's low. It's 20% or something. People aren't that interested. I love this stamp because it sums up the British attitude to Europe absolutely perfectly. There's a bull charging in one direction, and the rider is looking in the completely opposite direction. So we really don't know what we're doing. In the long run, of course, we've got to be part of Europe. That's the way things are, but it's kind of a slightly being dragged, screaming and kicking into it, and I think this stamp sums it up very nicely. And then, of course, here's poor Diana. What a sad stamp. You see her face on there. She doesn't look happy. She's glamorous. She's incredibly beautiful. They brought out, after she died, they had a set of 5 stamps of featuring pictures of her, and she's alone on every one of them. There's nobody else on them. And this is another issue, a bit like Edward VIII, it divides everybody in Britain. Who was Diana? Was she a simple girl who was sucked up into this corrupt system and chewed up and spat out by it, or was she a publicity-seeking, narcissistic, manipulative, whatever? You know, and there's big argument still in Britain, and people will get quite hot under the collar about Diana, whether she was good or bad. Either way, her death was an extraordinary event, which again changed British life in a very profound way. I remember going to Hyde Park and seeing all these flowers, thousands, millions of them, bunches of flowers left in the park, outside the palace, outside Kensington Gardens, everywhere, flowers and notes. A lot of them saying, "You were too good for them." Whoa. But it's the British suddenly got emotional at that time, because normally it's a stiff upper lip, old chap, and natives just stuck a spear in your leg. Well, think of England. Stop complaining. You've got one leg. Well, there is a wonderful story about some general at the Battle of Waterloo. General Picton, I think, was standing next to the Duke of Wellington, sitting on a horse next to the Duke of Wellington, and a cannon blew his leg off. And he said to Wellington, "Oh, by gad, my leg's been blown off." And Wellington said, "Oh gosh, so it has." And that was the end of the conversation. So that was kind of that was the old sort of British way of doing things. And that all changed. With 1997, there was a much more emotionally literate country emerged from it. Also, at the same time, there was the Labour government, the new Labour with Tony Blair, came into power, and that changed things a lot as well. The old Conservative government had been very good in a lot of ways, but it was rather rather cold. And I think Blair introduced a more sort of touchy-feely, emotionally literate, come back to that kind of government. A lot of things wrong, but that was a good change. He understood the Diana thing immediately. He penned this very famous speech about the People's Princess on the back of an envelope on the train on the way down to London. Whereas Haig, who was British, the Conservative Party leader, just sort of harumphed and fluffed around and didn't know what to make of it. Blair understood, got it absolutely right. So we're nearing the end of our journey through Britain. Here's we're now part of the World Wide Web. It's a nice stamp by Peter Till, showing the web being weaved. And of course it also sort of reflects Britain's globalised position now. We're all part of the global economy. We can't just sort of be in our own little enclave any longer. It's nicely celebrated on this stamp. Oh, I just put that in because I think that's kind of fun. It's a nicely designed stamp from 2006, Sounds of Britain. It's a diverse society that knows how to enjoy itself a bit, which I think is attractive. And finally, last but not least, oh, wonderful, very nice. What a splendid. The nice stamps, Mario Testino, good photographs, great event. But again, you see, we were terribly British about this. Before it happened, people weren't that enthusiastic. And some people were saying, the left-wingers were saying, oh, monarchy, we don't want all this money spent on it. And actually the right-wing people were saying the same, taxpayers' money being spent on this event. And there was a sort of general lack of interest until about 3 days beforehand, where everybody suddenly got incredibly excited, and we all watched it on television, and it was wonderful, absolutely brilliant, fantastic event, and just magical. And of course, I mean, it is very nice that they do actually love each other, which is unfortunately not the case with Charles and Diana. So it's a lovely way to conclude the story. I think that it is Britain carrying on with its traditions, but actually, if you flick back, please, just to the sounds of Britain, there's also a new aspect of the country as well. So it does kind of there's a continuity and change, which is what history is all about anyway, and it's, I think, very well reflected in our stamps. First, make a concluding comment. If we could just go to the Royal Couple again. Oh, wonderful book. Do I go out and buy it? So can you just go back to back one more? There we go. Back to the Royal Couple. Some does get touched on. What is the future of stamps themselves? Because you couldn't go into a post office, buy one of these, and stick it on a letter. You had to buy a special commemorative sheet to collect. And there's something slightly strange about that. There's a kind of postmodern artificiality to it, because all the other stamps we've seen in this show and all the stamps in this book, they were all designed to be used. You'd buy them, you'd put them on a letter, you'd send them through the post. This issue, okay, they're stamps and you could use them. I mean, it was, they would be honoured by the post office, but there was a sense in which they were being issued to be collected. And I think that happens more and more with stamps, and has been happening for a while. Which is okay for a while, but it's a bit like watering down a brand or something. You can only do it once. You can take a brand down market, it's really difficult to take it back up again. And there's a sense in which, and I haven't got a clever answer for this, but I worry about the future of stamps, because if they stop being things that people actually use and part of the fabric of everyday life, and just become things that people collect, that's not so interesting. The fun of collecting them is that they weren't made to be collected. They were made to be used. So I leave you with that conundrum. I suppose I'd also like to leave you with the thought of, when you go back to your collections, just think about the history and think about the people on these stamps and what they did and the stories the stamps tell. But, I mean, here's a wonderful thing, stamps tell stories. Look at your stamp collection and enjoy the stories, because they are wonderful. They are wonderful little time machines. So enjoy your journeys back in time. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a huge pleasure.
So we have we can spend about 5 to 7 minutes on questions and answers, and then at the end of that time, we'll invite you to continue the conversation out in the reception and book signing.
Lovely. Can you I might as well click it forward. Oh, no, no, respect to the king. Come on, let's keep it there. That's fine. I mean, future king, anyway. Questions, sir?
Oh, one moment.
Oh, right.
Thank you. I wondered what you thought is one of the rarest British stamps that you follow, your nation's stamps. Is it the £5 orange under Victoria?
Well, no, I suppose...
How rare is that? I think that's
it's pretty rare. It's pretty rare. But I mean, there was an Edwardian stamp. They did a twopenny Tyrian plum, which is incredibly rare, because they hardly made any of them. Well, they made quite a few, but they destroyed them all because the king died. And it's a lovely stamp. It's a beautiful stamp, the tuppence Tyrian plum. That's pretty rare.
All right. I have one other question. I watched the Titanic film that we have here, and they indicated there's 6 million packages and letters on that ship, and the bags are still down there. There's sea life growing on it. They show the registered room. There's a grate, and it looks partly open. I wondered, is there any interest in the British government in recovering the registered mail? It's clearly much more critical than the rest of it. Today's technology might permit such an operation.
They should do that. They should honour their obligation to the people who sent those letters. I quite agree. No, I agree, absolutely. But I mean, I don't know whether there is or not, I'm afraid, but there certainly should be. I mean, traditionally the post office has been very good at fulfilling its obligations and getting the post through. There's that lovely quote you have on your post office in New York about going through I can't remember what it says now, through the snow and the night and everything, but then the post office has been very good at that sort of thing. So maybe they will. Wouldn't that be nice? Thank you.
Wonderful presentation, but
Thank you.
I'm a collector of Great Britain, and
I kind of expected as you got towards the end, I'd see one of the country issues. That's become a big issue in Great Britain right now, to the point where Scotland's holding a referendum in a year.
Well, what I did have, so can you just ping it back a few to the, I'll tell you when to stop. You keep going. There. Oh, back. Yeah, there we are. This was a kind of country issue because it was British landscapes. You've got Sussex, Antrim, which is Northern Ireland, Harlech Castle in Wales, wonderful place, I've been there, and the Cairngorms in Scotland. So, and that was the start of well, it wasn't the start. We did have regional issues before. They had them when the new Queen came to the throne. We started having regional issues quite early on. But I think that's a nice little set which shows people thinking in terms of the regions. And of course now we've got this question of Scottish independence. Are the Scots going to go vote for independence? Who knows? I've no idea. So yes, that's another aspect of British life, which you kind of get out of those ones, I think. But yes, thank you for mentioning that. This gentleman here.
On the last stamp you
Oh,
showed.
one moment.
Oh, there's a lady coming.
Oh, okay. On the last stamp that it showed the prints, could you
Oh,
show
yeah.
that again?
Oh, sorry, can we run back to, or run forward? There we go.
The stamp on the left has no denomination, is that right?
We've got first on it, which is a first-class letter.
Oh, okay.
So we introduced this thing quite a long time ago with first-class and second-class mail, and that's a first-class stamp, which is kind of better than having a figure on it, because the stamps keep going up in price. You can keep using them. It's like the forever ones in the USA. It's the same idea.
Thank you.
Oh, madam, and there's a gentleman there.
Again, on the last stamp you've got there, it is, I don't know whether you planned it this way, but it's a very nice illustration of the point you made earlier about the British public's reaction to the death of Diana, the emergence of an emotional literacy, which is beautifully illustrated by this stamp.
It's lovely, isn't it? It is. It's lovely. Thank you. It is. It's beautifully done. Especially the one on the left, I think. And they love each other, which is good. It's good.
That level of emotion is almost unheard of.
Absolutely. Goodness me. What next? Goodness me. We didn't build an empire by being emotional. Sir?
The number 36, was that a fallout of when you started assembling these, or was that a pre-planned target for the
It was a
number stamps?
pre-planned target. I mean, I kind of hovered around that sort of number, and it just seems to be a nice number. It's a square. It's multiple. It's divisible by lots of numbers. And actually, the whole thing, A History of Britain in 36 Postage Stamps, seems to sort of roll off the tongue nicely. So it was a sort of vaguely artistic decision to choose 36. Thank you. Any more questions? Oh, sir.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Enjoyed the talk. Just
Thank you.
wondered, just the fact we've got the monarch's head on all the stamps through time in British history, how much do you think that reflects, that take, monarchist's view on Britain's history as opposed to a more political view? You mentioned how, swings back from conservatism to the socialism through Parliament, but you keep getting this reminder of the Queen. So it does give you kind of one side view of it. What was your comment on that?
Well, it does, yes. I mean, that's a fair point. But I think it's a point that most people in Britain share. And it's not the case that the modern Labour Party, for example, wants to get rid of the Queen. It's very much a minority view in Britain. The monarchy was very unpopular around the time of Diana's death. And that was probably one of its low points. It was unpopular in the 60s when sort of Britain was becoming very modern and swinging and groovy, and they thought the monarchs were a bit fuddy-duddy. But it's never been the monarchies, by and large, it's popular. The thing is with the monarchy, we take the mick out of the monarchs quite a lot. It's a very British thing. We make fun of them, we have satirical programs that laugh at them, but we don't want to get rid of them, because we like them, really. We're fond of them. And I think there's a kind of affectionate teasing about the monarchs that's part of British life. And if you look back in history, where actually, if you look at, go back to the 18th century and see cartoons by Rowlandson and things, now they're vicious. That's vicious satire that nowadays you don't get. So, no, I think it's appropriate to have the monarch on the stamps because people like it. And also, the monarch is a symbol of the nation as a whole. And I think That's where Edward VIII got it wrong, is he kind of got involved in politics. And that's a mistake, because the monarch is above politics. They are a symbol of the nation. And I know in America you have a president who's elected, but there are symbols like the White House, like Air Force One. There are things which, and the flag, which symbolize the nation. And the monarch is all part of that. So I think the monarch is a symbol of the fact that there's a phrase that politicians have been using, and everybody laughs at them quite rightly when they do use it, but it is true when you think of it in a bigger perspective. You know, we're all in it together, and the monarch is a symbol of that, and that's what, you know, that's what we're reminded of at these royal events. It is an event for everybody, and so I think it's, you know, it's right and proper that the monarch should be on the stamp, and I think most people in Britain would agree. This isn't just my view of a man in middle age. I think it's a generally held view that people have a lot of respect for the monarchy, and I think it's good that she's on the stamp. Long may she stay there. Well, I think she ought to abdicate soon and give Charles a go, but I mean, that's just a personal feeling.
Well, let's continue this out in the reception
Absolutely.
and book signing. One more round.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.